Good morning, everyone. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all our esteemed speakers. Today, each of them is an authority in uveitis and known for the contribution in the field. I would also like to thank the AIOS Scientific Committee for this opportunity for the instruction course, which we have titled Learning from My Mistakes in Uveitis. I'll be proceeding with my talk on how not to confuse VKH and CSC. So broadly, VKH and CSC are both choroidal pathologies. VKH is a primary stromal choroiditis caused by an autoimmune reaction against tyrosinase-like proteins in melanocytes in the uvea, inner ear, meninges, and the integumentary system. CSC, on the other hand, occurs because of choroidal vascular hyperpermeability, resulting in fluid leakage at the level of the retinal pigment epithelium. So what are the common features? Both of them are choroidal disorders and can have common clinical manifestations such as serous retinal detachment and leakage from RPE on FA. CSC can therefore often be misdiagnosed as VKH, particularly when it presents with bilateral serous retinal detachments and increased choroidal thickness on EDI OCT. So what are the tools that we have to differentiate the two conditions? The most commonly performed test after fundus examination is OCT and followed by angiography, both FA and ICGA, and more recently, OCT angiography. So I will be discussing this case to illustrate a couple of these modalities and how they help in differentiating VKH and CSC. This was a 41-year-old male. He presented recently to me with sudden diminution of vision in both eyes. Vision was 6 by 120 in both eyes with visual acuity of with intraocular pressure of 13 and 14 millimeters of mercury. Anterior segment was within normal limits. There was no AC cellular reaction or flare. This is the posterior segment picture of the patient showing media clarity grade 1. There was no vitritis. The discs were normal and we had presence of serous retinal detachment in both eyes. Had this been a unilateral case, my first differential would have been CSC, but because of the bilaterality, there was a diagnostic confusion. So we went ahead with the OCT of the patient passing through the macula. And here we can see there is presence of the subretinal fluid. And along with that, we also see presence of this intraretinal collection. And what this actually is there is presence of a split at the level of the inner segment myoid. And we can see the ELM draping over the roof of this intraretinal split in the myoid zone. So this has been described as the basilarity layer detachment, and it points towards inflammatory pathology. This is the other eye of the patient where we can see a similar subretinal fluid and the split in the inner segment myoid or the basilarity layer detachment. And there has been a publication recently from the PGI group with the largest series of acute VKH disease with basilarity layer detachment. So this OCT itself pointed towards a diagnosis of VKH, and I was pretty sure that this patient needs steroids for the treatment. So just to emphasize that how OCT helps in differentiating VKH and CSC. In CSC, we have subretinal fluid without the presence of basilarity layer detachment. It has not been described so far in CSC except a case of inflammatory CSC, which was associated with the underlying diagnosis of SLE. And CSC usually has serous PEDs and localized RPE bulges. And on the other hand, VKH is associated with presence of RPE folds and RPE undulations. And we may even see choroidal granulomas in VKH on EDI OCT. So coming back to the patient, this was the fluorescein angiogram of the patient. The right scan is a bit decentered, but we can make out these hypofluorescent round lesions in the superior part of the macula. And in the left eye, what's important is to look for these subtle RPE leakages in the peripapillary area, and we can see them more prominently in the temporal part of the macula. And this is the mid phase where we can see a presence of multiple round hyperfluorescent lesions throughout the macular region. And in the left eye also, we have these round hyperfluorescent lesions suggestive of choroidal stromal inflammation. And we can also see that the RPE leakages have become more prominent in the peripapillary area. And this is the late phase showing the pooling of the dye in both eyes. So this clinched the diagnosis of VKH, and the patient was treated with IV methylpred and oral steroids. And this is the fundus photograph 5 days after the initiation of treatment. And there is significant resolution of the subretinal fluid, and the bacillary layer detachment has also disappeared now. His vision improved to 636 by 612 in just 5 days. Now, this is the second case of a 35-year-old female who presented with a unilateral diminution of vision in her left eye. She had no AC reaction, no vitritis, and this media haze is because of presence of posterior subcapsular cataract. So the OCT of the patient showed presence of subretinal fluid, and the lower panel, this is showing presence of this peripapillary RP bulge with the oval area of hyporeflectivity, suggestive of a choroidal granuloma. There is presence of a subretinal fluid here and a similar bacillary layer detachment split at the level of the myoid zone in this patient also. So this OCT itself is indicative of the underlying pathology. Of course, we have to rule out other infectious causes of granulomatous uveitis. But once we have done that, when it's the question of differentiating between VKH and CSC, these findings on OCT clearly go in favor of VKH. So this is the combined FA ICG of the patient. The FA is showing the hypofluorescent lesions, which are much more in number, and they are prominent on ICG. And in the late phase, FA shows the hypolesions turning into hyperfluorescence and with pooling of the dye on. And on ICG, we can see the persistence of the hypofluorescent lesions, suggestive of full thickness choroidal granulomas. Now, this has this sort of choroidal stromal inflammation, diffuse choroidal stromal inflammation, has been described as one of the essential diagnostic criteria now for the diagnosis of acute new onset VKH disease. In this recent publication by Herbert et al. For the diagnostic criteria for initial onset VKH disease. So we should look for this kind of features of choroidal stromal inflammation on ICG. And if we find these features like early choroidal stromal hyperfluorescence or fuzzy choroidal vessels and presence of hypofluorescent dark dots on ICG, it clinches the diagnosis of VKH. And coming to OCT angiography, this is a very useful non-invasive tool and it can help in the acute stages of VKH where it shows multiple dark foci of flow deficit, suggestive of choriocapillaris hypoperfusion. And in the previous patient, this is the FA-ICG, and this is the OCT angiography on fast image at the level of the choriocapillaris, which shows these dark round areas of flow deficit, which correspond exactly with the areas of hypofluorescence on ICG, which basically correlate with the choroidal granulomas. So these areas, dark areas seen on OCT angiography, represent true choriocapillaris hypoperfusion. And as we can see on the structural on-fast image, there is no signal loss. So this is true flow deficit representing OCT angio. So just to conclude that in CSC, OCT angio will show these dark areas, but they do not represent flow deficit. Rather, they are just due to signal loss because of presence of PED or subretinal fluid. So my take-home messages, there are just a few key points that one should keep in mind. On OCT, presence of bacillary layer detachment, RPE folds, and undulations indicate VKH, whereas serous PEDs are in favor of CSC. On FFA, early pinpoint RPE leaks are present in VKH and should be differentiated from the expanding dot sign of CSC. Disc hyperfluorescence is helpful criteria when present, and it goes in favor of initial onset VKH. On ICGA, presence of diffuse stromal choroiditis in the form of hyperfluorescent dark dots or fuzzy choroidal stromal vessels is a sign in favor of VKH. It's the most important, in fact, it's the key feature of acute initial onset VKH. And on OCT angiography, areas of flow deficit depicting choriocapillaris ischemia is a useful non-invasive tool. to differentiate the two conditions. Thank you. I would like to invite Dr. Partho for his presentation on differentiating toxoplasma and viral retinitis. Dr. Partho is a senior consultant in the UV and intraocular inflammation department, Shankar Nethralaya, and he would be taking us through this confusing situation between toxo and viral retinitis.
Thanks, Kanika. Thanks for inviting me to this wonderful instruction course. So good morning, everyone. So I'll be talking on differentiating toxoplasma and viral retinitis. So I'll just, for the audience, if you have any question, if it remains unanswered, or you are watching the recording later in YouTube or some other social media, mail me. You can mail your query to me. This is my email ID. I'll be happy to answer your query. So to start with, I'll start with the case. A 30-year-old female, she complained of floaters for 20 days with diminution of vision for 10 days. And she also had a history of fever 1 month back. The serology carried out during the febrile illness was inconclusive, and the physician treated her as a case of viral fever. So when she went to a local ophthalmologist, you can see the fundus photograph here. The patient was diagnosed as neuroretinitis or query viral retinitis, started on acyclovir and oral corticosteroid for 2 days, and the patient was referred to us. As you can see here, the referral doctor actually thought it as a minimal hyperemia, and there was a patch of retinitis, and the hard exudates were scattered as an incomplete macular fan. So on examination, her visual acuity in the left eye was 2/60, and the slit lamp examination showed a white anterior chamber, few cells in the anterior vitreous. So as you can see the fundus, I'll just zoom the picture. You can see here, though they marked it as a vasculitis, if you see this carefully, you can see the whitish deposits over the blood vessels. And you can see varying degrees of the subretinal fluid scattered around this lesion. So the fundus fluorescent angiography showed the hypofluorescence and gradually the dye leaking from the margin of the lesions. And if you can see, these vessels were not leaking the fluorescence. So we went ahead, and you can see here the SSOCT showed this. I'll show you that video where it shows the deposits in the inner retinal surface and the retrohyaloid space. I think it's not playing. So it was showing. So we investigated the patient, and the patient's antitoxo IgG and IgM both were raised, and the patients were started on the trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole combination, clindamycin 300 mg 4 times a day with the oral steroid. And this is the picture in 1 week, 6 week, and 3 months. At the 3-month follow-up, her visual acuity was 6/6. Another case, a 23-year-old healthy male presented with floaters in right eye for 1 month. There was blurring of vision for 10 days, and his intraocular pressure was raised. It was 40 millimeter of mercury when he presented elsewhere. The patient were subjected to investigations like anti-CMV antibodies. IgG was raised, whereas the HSV and VZV was within normal limit. The patient was referred as acute retinal necrosis. So as you can see here, when we examined the patient, his visual acuity was 6/6 and the left eye was 6/5. So slit lamp showed this 1+ cells flare, and the left eye was quiet. And the intraocular pressure, with the help of anti-glaucoma medication, it was 18 millimeter of mercury. And you can see here there was yellowish white granular opacity in the extreme periphery. So I'll just zoom it further, and you can see here there is some areas of the healing you can notice here in between the lesion. And we started investigating the patients. The patient's toxo IgG was highly raised, whereas the normal IgM was normal. The PCR from aqueous aspirate was negative for all, but it was positive for Toxoplasma gondii. So the patient was started on anti-Toxoplasma treatment, and after a month, you can see here, this was the response. The lesion healed completely. So coming to the ocular toxoplasma and viral retinitis, the ocular toxoplasma remains the most common cause of posterior uveitis, whereas the viral retinitis is relatively rare but can be seen in our day-to-day clinical practice. So that's what actually what happens, because we are familiar with the toxoplasma. So we always think of common clinical phenotypes like headlight in fog or satellite lesions. Whereas the viral retinitis, it's basically an umbrella term. There is no definite clinical phenotype with it. It can present as acute retinal necrosis. It can present, various etiology also. It can present due to cytomegaloviruses. It can have a manifestation after febrile illness like dengue or chikungunya. So it has a broad spectrum, and all these terms come under a umbrella called viral retinitis. Now, toxoplasma and viral retinitis, there are certain similarities in them. So both these clinical entities can present as hypertensive uveitis. They can be associated with anterior chamber inflammation, often granulomatous, and they usually have a significant reaction in the vitreous. And another important reason for confusion is the ocular toxoplasmosis in very early stage can have retinitis-like lesions. As you can see here, the toxocyst actually get ruptures from the retinal surfaces, and gradually they go externally towards the choroid. So first there is a retinitis, then it involves the choroid. So at very early stage, there can be inner retinal involvement and can present like this. So I'll just try to conclude with 3 learning lessons to differentiate between toxo and viral. The number 1 is you have failure to identify the atypical clinical presentations. Often we don't pay attention to atypical form like Chilaid's arteritis, which usually do not leak in fluorescent angiography, whereas a normal vasculitis will leak. There can be presentation like neuroretinitis, and there can be like the retinochoroiditis around the optic disc, which is earlier known as Jensen's choroiditis. Remember the other differentials of Jensen's choroiditis. These are the TB and toxocariasis. So you have to remember that toxoplasma is not always headlight in fog or reactivation around the scar. Also, you have to remember that certain things are though rare but can occur, like the hemorrhages, uncommon but can be seen sometimes. The pigmented changes usually occurs relatively late in the disease process. And also beware of the HIV or immunosuppressed patients where the toxoplasma can be diffuse and fulminant and can resemble the retinitis. The number 2 is not using the imaging. So you have to imaging in doubtful cases. The OCT can be a very useful tool. This is a very interesting article, and I'll request all the ophthalmologists to go through this article. So this article has given some important points to differentiate between toxo and the viral retinitis. So ocular toxoplasmosis is characterized by hyperreflective, these oval deposits. And also it can have the round deposits like you can see here in the posterior hyaloid. And in mirror, sometimes it can have this mirror imaging deposits like retinal surfaces, as you can see here with these double arrows. Whereas the viral retinitis, these round shaped deposits are relatively uncommon. Coming to this choroidal enhanced depth in imaging, the ocular toxoplasmosis, the hyperreflectivity of the choroid can be seen beneath this necrotic focus. Also, there can be you can appreciate the choroidal architecture damage, which is characterized by the absence of the hyperreflective septa within the choroid. Whereas these features are relatively absent in viral retinitis, the choroidal architecture is largely preserved, and you don't see any obscuring the underlying choroid beneath the viral retinitis lesions. The number 3, do not treat based on the serological test. The TORCH titer to diagnose a viral retinitis can be sometimes can be dangerous, because these are the ubiquitous organisms. So mere presence of positive serological test does not mean anything. So for example, I have seen a referral where the test serological, based on the serological test, the anterior uveitis was thought to be a cytomegalovirus anterior uveitis. So you have to do this test very carefully. Always go by your clinical judgment, and in doubtful cases, PCR may help. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
Dr. Partho, for the lovely illustrative cases and for clarifying so many aspects of toxo-retinitis. I would now like to invite Dr. Manisha Agarwal. She's a senior consultant uveitis specialist at the Shroff Charity Eye Hospital. Ma'am, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and thank you AIOS and Kanika for making me a part of this IC today morning. So I would be just speaking on some learning lessons from identifying masquerades. So what do you mean by a masquerade? So masquerade basically is a process that simulates a benign disease, and that's exactly what we mean when we use the term masquerade. So let's go through these two cases, which were a learning process for me and my team. So this was a 3-year-old girl child who presented with pain and redness in the left eye for last 4 months. She was diagnosed 4 months back. She was diagnosed 4 months back as anterior uveitis and not responding to the treatment being given in the form of topical steroid drops. She had also developed a secondary glaucoma and was already on 2 anti-glaucoma medications. So on examination, the child fixed and followed light. The slit lamp of the right eye was unremarkable, but the left eye showed a mild conjunctival congestion. It had a mid-dilated pupil, and the AC had white fluffy exudates. But to our surprise, where we were very highly suspicious of a retinoblastoma in this child, the central fundus appeared all very normal. So we said, okay, maybe we are not able to pick up a peripheral lesion, so let's go ahead and do a B scan. And to our utter surprise, even the ultrasound B scan was absolutely normal. So this was a big dilemma in our mind that what this child was having. So this is the fundus. You see, it's absolutely normal. The baseline blood investigations were all normal. The child was planned for examination under anesthesia. The IOPs were still high, even though the child was already on 2 anti-glaucoma medications. So we went ahead and planned an examination under anesthesia, and the ciliary processes were still found to be studied 360 degree with this fluffy white material. So though reluctant, we went ahead and did a long intracorneal track AC tap using a 30 gauge needle to avoid any kind of metastasis if at all we were dealing with a malignancy which was hiding somewhere. So finally, this child was enucleated with a ball implant was done. A gross pathology of the enucleated globe showed fluffy whitish material in the anterior chamber over the ciliary body, lens zonules and anterior vitreous. The histopathology was basophilic tumor cells on the iris surface and the entire ciliary body region. Choroid and sclera were normal. The surgical end of the optic nerve was free from tumor cells. And cytopathology put our entire diagnostic dilemma to rest, where there were numerous basophilic cohesive cells with hyperchromic nuclei and scanty cytoplasm, very highly suggestive of a retinoblastoma. So ultrasound, abdomen, and MRI was normal. There was no further intervention which was advised to this child because the child did not have any high-risk features such as involvement of the optic nerve or choroidal invasion. She was reviewed by the pediatric oncologist, and the final diagnosis that we arrived in this child was a diffuse anterior retinoblastoma. Now, when we reviewed the literature, what exactly is a diffuse anterior retinoblastoma? This is a term which was coined by Gross-Niklaus in 1998. And the average age of presentation is 6 years with no calcification at all, which is seen on the B scan. It can be sporadic and it can be also unilateral with a very slow progression and with a very poor response to the therapy. And always it has, now what we know exactly about retinoblastoma is that it always has a primary focus of tumor in retina. But in our child, we had absolutely no lesion in the retina. And what is said for diffuse anterior retinoblastoma is that you can have microscopic foci of this tumor in the retina, which is clinically not visible. And that is where we went wrong in diagnosing this child as a retinoblastoma, because we apparently could not see any tumor lesion when we examined the fundus. So when you are in a diagnostic dilemma, I think it is absolutely mandatory that you have to revise your diagnosis and you have to do a more thorough clinical examination. So the lessons learned from this child was that you had a young child with unusual fluffy exudates in the anterior chamber, being diagnosed as anterior uveitis and being treated with topical steroids for a very long time, not responding to the treatment for last 4 months, already developing complications due to the long-term steroids in the form of glaucoma. Now it was the time to revise the diagnosis or send for another opinion or do an EUA examination or some interventional diagnosis was required. And this is where we were able to clinch the diagnosis in this particular child. Now, the second patient, again, is another extreme age of the patient that I'm presenting, is a 72-year-old male patient with diminution of vision in the right eye for last 3 months, hypertensive and on treatment for last 15 years, with a past history of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 2015, but already in remission phase, now diagnosed with uveitis and vitritis. This patient again was on treatment with topical steroids and topical anti-glaucoma for last 3 months and was on treatment basically being diagnosed as a case of uveitis. Now, when this patient presented, he had a vision of 6/9 You see there was a bilateral vitritis more in the right eye. And when we did a cursory examination for the uveitis profile, it was all within normal. Now, what clinched our eyes was the small lesion that we could see through the vitritis in the right eye. We went ahead and did an OCT for this patient, and what we found was very typical sub-RPE deposits. So we went ahead and did a diagnostic vitrectomy after stopping oral steroids for 2 weeks. The vitreous sample taken was sent for cytopathology and for immunochemistry. But this was really not very suggestive of anything. It just showed high cellularity with sheets of lymphocytes, and it suggested a chronic or an acute non-specific inflammatory reaction. Even the immunohistochemistry report showed acute on chronic inflammation with no evidence of any kind of malignancy. A PET scan of the whole body was done, and the oncologist confirmed to us that the patient was actually in a remission phase, and there was evidence of no active lesion in the body. So after 2 weeks after the core vitrectomy, we found that the lesion has now grown very, very significantly in size. And now the left eye of the patient also started developing these multiple lesions in the left eye, which were a matter of concern. So we revised and we went ahead and did the OCT again, which showed a much larger size lesion in the right eye. There was again the sub-RPE deposits, which were very much suggestive of a lymphoma in this particular patient. Very classical appearance even in the left eye, which was suggesting us that we are dealing with an intraocular lymphoma. This is the fundus fluorescein angiography of this patient. What you can see is very prominently, we can see the hyperfluorescence of this lesion surrounded by a leopard spot kind of an appearance. These are the multiple lesions again in the left eye. So we went ahead and did a left eye core vitrectomy with the hope that we can catch something on a lab diagnosis, but again, there was no evidence of any malignant cells. Now, based on the clinical suspicion, we went ahead and treated this patient with intravitreal injections of methotrexate. And both the eyes, they underwent 2 injections of methotrexate. And you see that this was the presentation. At the time of presentation, the patient had a small lesion. After co-vitrectomy, already after 1 month, literally, the size had grown in, the lesion had grown in size. And after 2 injections of methotrexate, we find that the lesion completely has melted away. If you see the left eye, again, the response has been extremely good after 2 injections of methotrexate, where all the lesions have literally melted away in the left eye after 20 days of giving 2 injections of methotrexate. The follow-up OU intraocular lymphoma secondary to systemic B-cell lymphoma was the final diagnosis made in this particular patient. Patient had no new lesion for 6 months and continued to maintain a vision of 6/6 and 6 in both the eyes. The patient was referred back to the treating oncologist for a re-evaluation, and there was again no evidence of any reactivation of the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So there's something called as secondary intraocular lymphoma, which typically occurs in older patients, although it can appear in young children. Most of the patients have a known history of systemic lymphoma, although intraocular disease may be the initial presentation. Now, the patients may present with lymphomatous uveal infiltrates several months following a successful treatment of the systemic lymphoma. And at this stage, there may not be evidence of systemic disease, despite an extensive laboratory evaluation and other kinds of evaluations, such as a diagnostic vitrectomy. So this was again a learning for all of us, where you may not find really any evidence of a reactivation of the systemic lymphoma. The learning lessons are: an elderly gentleman unlikely to have first episode of uveitis at this age, not responding to treatment of vitritis for last 1 month, a clinical suspicion which took a precedence over all the kinds of the lab reports, including a PET scan. A detailed history taking was of utmost importance. If we would have missed a past history of lymphoma, probably we would not have reached our diagnosis. So I would just conclude by saying that when should we suspect a masquerade? It would be in the extremes of age, unusual clinical presentation, patient not responding to the usual treatment, and most often it can be fatal if it is not detected on time. So I would just conclude by saying that eyes are useless when the mind is blind, and always listen to your heart. It may be on your left, but it is always right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Indeed, very challenging cases. And now I would like to invite Dr. Vishali. She's the head of retina and uveitis and professor of ophthalmology at PGI Chandigarh. She will be speaking on when I thought it was TB, but it turned out to be something else.
Thank you for the kind invite. So, most of the time in my practice, it is that I think of not TB and it turns out to be TB. At least that's the kind of the cases I see. So when Kanika gave me this topic, I remembered this case, which we had seen ages ago, but this was the case that personally taught me a lot as a resident. So I dig out this case from the archives. Now, this is a very interesting case of a 15-year-old girl. She is a girl which was initially diagnosed as pulmonary TB and treated on anti-TB treatment. While on anti-TB treatment, she complained of blurred vision and went to some Center A in New Delhi. Patient was seen. These are the kind of the pictures which was done at that point in that center. So she was told that she has tuberculosis in the eye. ATT was continued and steroids were added, 60 milligram for 2 weeks, and later they were kind of reduced. Patient was asked to come back after 2 weeks when Visolone was kind of further tapered, and it was given for about a month and brought down quickly. But however, the first episode that occurred was in April 2005. Till February 2005, she is still continuing to receive ATT because ophthalmologists wanted her to give what is called long-term ATT. She had a vision, lesions had healed, and she had a vision of 6/6. Now, left eye had some retrolental cells which were noted and absolute scotoma on Emsler chart. They also did ELISA for toxo. And at that point of time, when she went to an ophthalmologist, they say, well, you have a recurrence. There is a new lesion which has come up. A fluorescein angiogram was done. Toxo came out to be positive. So toxo treatment was added. And she was told that you continue TB treatment, and toxo was added. This was February 2006. They also do the fluorescein in this particular center, and on fluorescein, they told her that this lesion, she's a qualified engineer, so that's what she told us, that this new lesion which is developing is the new one, and for that she needs more steroids, ATT to continue, and toxo treatment to continue. So she was kind of confused with what is happening, flies across the country thousands of miles to go to Center C. On 30th March 2006, she's seen at a tertiary care referral institute in South India, where she's diagnosed as macular serpiginous choroiditis, based on the pictures which were taken at that particular time in that center. She was started on Imuron 50 milligram 3 times a day to be tapered. Prednisolone was given with a protocol for tapering and was seen by a physician as well, who advised her to continue Isonics from March till June 2006. She remained asymptomatic. She became symptomatic again in August 2006 and went to another center back home in New Delhi, Center D, where she was noted still to have a vision of 6/6, both eyes, and she was diagnosed as papillitis with inflammation, macular serpiginous choroiditis, and Mycept was added to whatever was going on already. They also suspected that it's the toxoplasma which has got reactivated, and added Septron, azathioprine, PSD Kenacort. She develops glaucoma, undergoes glaucoma filtration surgery. Finally, when we saw her, she was 18-year-old. She had received anti-TB on almost continuous basis for 3 years. That is because she has been jumping from one place to other and nobody bothered to stop ATT because they haven't started, so it's not their responsibility. She had received 3 courses of anti-toxo treatment. She was still getting 20 milligram Visalone, ATT, and anti-toxo treatment. And she says, I have lost vision in my left eye, and she was planning to go to US, and her career was at stake. So when we examined, her vision was 624. There was no inflammation. She did have glaucoma filtration bleb because of the surgery, too many steroids, and pressure was controlled. This is what she looked like. She had some ERM, extensive scar, and she was advised to taper off prednisolone, stop ATT, stop anti-toxo drugs, and she had a membrane at the edge of the scar, which you can see very clearly, and she was given intravitreal anti-VEGF. And just 9 months following Avastin, she doesn't have recurrence, and 3 years later, she communicated to us that she was doing well. So what went wrong? Now, simply because this patient had pulmonary TB, she presents to an ophthalmologist, it automatically does not become ocular TB. Because if you look at the phenotype, Partho showed it so beautifully. This looks like toxo. He showed you pictures of Jensen's toxo. So these are the lesions of retinitis, which is very typical for toxoplasmosis. She did not receive any anti-toxo at this point. She was diagnosed as TB choroiditis, managed as TB choroiditis, I think the saving grace was that steroids were not given for very long. That is how the disease did not become too crazy. 6 months later, second episode, what she had was this small little membrane that was developing next to the toxo scar. However, at this point, she was diagnosed as reactivation of toxo and given a second course of antitoxo medication. So, what we have to understand is when it was confused with TB, that is because they have written there was choroiditis. But if we look at the choroiditis, it's very different from a CNVM which was developing in toxo. Toxo, I don't have to tell you, it may present as a satellite lesion as Partho has beautifully shown, but it can present as an isolated lesion in the acquired form. So you just have to know about the phenotype and not confuse it with tuberculosis. Her third episode, when she went to Center C, this was not really TB serpiginous choroiditis. These were three isolated different lesions where she had developed scars from the previous visit. So this shows you the importance of how important it is to dig out the past pictures and look what patient had the phenotype when she presented to the first ophthalmologist. Because if you look at this right the way she presented, anybody would say, well, it could be macular serpiginous choroiditis. But if you know the history and the backdrop, you would not do that. And this is just to show macular serpiginous choroiditis, which is deep in the choroid, and the fluorescein is very different. So coming to her last episode, this is what went wrong. This is my last slide. Mistaking toxoretinochoroiditis for TB choroiditis, missing inflammatory CNV for reactivation of choroiditis, and mistaking CNV for serpiginous choroiditis. How can all this be avoided? Just spend time in understanding the morphology. Look at the simple clinical clues. This is an old case which I'm showing based on the clinical acumen, but these days we have a lot of imaging modalities. But as Manisha pointed out very rightly, that your eyes will not see what your brain does not know. So train your brain to look at the phenotype and not go on by, investigations or whatever is happening in the rest of the body. Some tests, some immunological tests, somewhere in the body, you start pushing the treatment. That's not how it should be. Thank you very much, Kanika, once again.
Thank you, ma'am. Wonderful case, and it reiterates the fact that we need to rely on our clinical acumen much more than any labs or any imaging modalities. And just by doing a good clinical examination, we can arrive at the correct diagnosis most of the time. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Padma Malini. She is the head of the Uveitis and Oculoimmunology Services at Narayan Nethralaya in Bengaluru. Welcome, ma'am. She will be speaking on the use of local steroids in uveitis. Ma'am, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Kanika. Good morning to all. At the outset, I thank you for including me in the exciting IC. I'm happy to speak on commandments in using local steroids and when to avoid. Corticosteroids can be used in the form of topical medications, periocular steroid injections, intravitreal injections, intravitreal implant, and antiphoresis. Let's see with case examples. The first is a case about use of topical steroids. Here, a 38-year male presented with a history of recurrent anterior uveitis in 2012 with a history of using topical steroids and anti-glaucoma medications on and off. Examination of the right eye was absolutely fine. The left eye had central KP with AC reaction. Clinically, it looked like a kind of a Poshner-Salzman kind of a picture. So during the acute episode, the patient underwent AC tap, suspecting it's a viral etiology, came negative for HSV, ZV, and CMV. The patient was continued with topical steroids and anti-glaucoma medication, and the patient went back to the referring doctor. Again, in 2016, he was referred to as not responding to topical steroids and anti-glaucoma medication. In spite of the medications, the intraocular pressure was 35 in the left eye, and patient started seeing halos around the light. Confocal revealed central globula with dendritic, suggestive of an infective etiology. We repeated the AC tab. This time CMV came positive. In addition to this topical steroids and anti-glaucoma medication, patient was put on this topical anti-CMV treatment, which he did not respond. Subsequently, we have to put him on oral anti-CMV treatment as well. So this is a graph showing in 2014, PCR was negative. The patient was treated locally with multiple recurrences. Here in 2016, when we repeated, CMV was positive and antiviral therapy for the CMV virus was started. Subsequently, you could see there is no recurrence of inflammation. Again, due to the financial constraint, the patient stopped the medication, got the recurrence, again went back to treatment. So in these conditions, antiviral therapy definitely plays a role in reducing the recurrence of inflammation. Just continuing the steroids alone may not be sufficient in controlling this inflammation. This particular person started showing the disc changes as well. The learning point from this case is recurrent anterior uveitis needs to be treated with high index of suspicion. Once AC tap does not rule out viral etiology, we need to keep repeating the test, and using the topical steroids has to be combined with the antiviral therapy. Otherwise, the steroids alone can cause disc changes. Confocal helps in identifying the infective etiology. The next, we'll move on to the case 2. It's about posterior subtenon steroid injection. A 63-year male presented with fever and skin rashes. He gave history of scrotal herpes and is a known diabetic. This is the old record the patient carried. He had a retinitis kind of a lesion, which early hypo with late hyperfluorescence in both eyes. OCT revealed hyperreflectivity with after-shadowing effects. So the treating doctor suspected it is a case of post-fever retinitis, and periocular steroid PST was given. Subsequently, there was a worsening. At this point, patient was referred to me. And examination at AC reaction and also the vitreous reaction. Here we could see the hyperemic disc with retinitis lesion. It's extended compared to what the old report showed. The same changes were seen in both eyes. Suspected viral etiology. OCT showed hyperreflectivity after shadowing with hyperreflective dots involving the full thickness of the retina in the right eye. This is the old record, the posterior subtenons, following which there was worsening of the reaction. So AC tap came positive for the CMV virus. So patient was put on intravitreal along with systemic valganciclovir therapy. In addition to that, patient had persistent CME for which we have to give anti-VEGF injection. Following multiple anti-CMV intravitreal ganciclovir injections along with oral ganciclovir therapy, we could see the resolving retinitis with ERM formation in both eyes. This is the final follow-up. Already the changes have started in. The visual acuity was 660 in both eyes. It is important to check the history of herpes zoster. This particular patient had scrotal herpes which was missed, and PST was given thinking that it is a case of post-fever retinitis. And on top of it, he had a diabetic with systemic immune status was compromised due to the uncontrolled sugar. The periocular steroid resulted in reactivation of a viral retinitis. So we need to be careful with injecting periocular steroid injections in suspected or past history of viral infection. Case 3 is about intravitreal triamcinolone acetate injection, IVTA. So case 3 is a known diabetic. She had NPDR with DME with macular edema and also had superadded vein occlusion, for which she was given IVTA by the local retina specialist following the diabetic macular edema. 3.5 weeks following IVTA, she presented with decreased vision and diagnosed of acute retinal necrosis in the left eye. AC tap came positive for the varicella zoster virus infection in this patient. OCT shows macular edema, and retinal opacification in the retinal periphery with undulation. When we probed the history, she gave history of chickenpox and developed VZV associated acute retinal necrosis and treated with valacyclovir and lesion resolved with the formation of atrophic retina. She developed a retinal wound. Subsequently, she underwent a VIA surgery to settle a retina. Learning point, always we need to check the previous history of viral infections before injecting depot steroids. And the control of blood sugar is also important. These patients can develop viral reactivation as in the form of acute retinal necrosis as we seen in this case. The case 4 is about Osidex implant, that is intravitreal dexamethasone implant. 60 years May, history of vitrectomy with SF-IOL for a traumatic subluxated IOL with RD in the left eye. Right eye, barrage laser was done for lattice degeneration. Subsequently, patient developed macular edema. It was not responding to anti-VEGF or IVTA, an inadequate response. There was a persistence of CMV with SRF. This particular patient was managed by our retina colleagues. This is a cystoid macular edema. Because of that refractory persistent cystoid macular edema, they decided to go ahead with the Osidex injection. 1 month later, patient presented with smoky vision, seeing moving line in front of the eye. The visual acuity is dropped to 22,000. Anterior segment examination showed corneal edema, DM folds. What we see is something like hypopyon. It is not hypopyon. It is a Osidex implant which has migrated into the anterior chamber, mimicking hypopyon. At anterior segment OCT also showing the implant in the anterior chamber. Patient was advised to avoid prone position. 1 week later, the Osidex migrated back into the posterior segment and the visual acuity has improved to 20 to 200. This is 2 months follow-up. There is a resolution of the macular edema and there was no migration of implant into the anterior chamber. The learning point from this case, dexamethasone implant to be avoided in patients with SF-IOL. We know this has to be avoided, but in this particular patient was refractory to treatment. They took a chance and they injected the SF-IOL. SF-IOL has to be, dexamethasone implant has to be avoided in case of posterior capsular opening, zonular dehiscence or aphakia, and also in cases of steroid responders. Case 5 is a 43-year female, known case of rheumatoid arthritis. She was referred to us by the rheumatologist as a second opinion. Primarily, she's a dentist from US. She was treated for necrotizing scleritis. Initially, she was treated with methotrexate, cyclosporine, and cyclophosphamide. Patient was not responding. They've added posterior subtenon injection to her right eye. Subsequently, they have tried infliximab, adalimumab, which did not work. Secondly, anti-TB drugs and oral steroids were started. At this moment, the patient was not responding to satisfactory level. Then she was referred to us for second opinion. This is a SPK, marginal infiltrate with corneal melt, and also we could see the scleral thinning and scleritis. This is an old record. She had a PUK with active scleritis. At this moment, she received a periocular posterior subtenon injections. Scleral patch graft is failed. When we evaluated negative for most of the organisms, we advised the patient to continue ATT and systemic steroids, and we added JAK kinase inhibitors, baricitinib under cover of antiviral therapy. Subsequently, patient is showing response to treatment. Learning point from this case, better to avoid depot injections in patients with scleritis. In case of necrotizing scleritis, yes, when we are giving injections, we have to choose the site carefully. In a case of a nodular scleritis, we give injection adjacent to the nodules. In a case of a diffuse, we give the injection in the central portion of the lesion. Coming to the take-home points, we need to have high index of suspicion of pathology in recurrent uveitis, especially when associated with ocular hypertension. Cautious use of topical steroids in cases of CMV anterior uveitis and in steroid responders. Cautious use of depot steroids in patients with unidentified etiology or suspected underlying viral infection or somewhere old history of herpes zoster. Steroid implant to be avoided with zonular dehiscence or aphakia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, ma'am, for enlightening about the use of steroids in uveitis. We go on
ভালো
to the
মাছ পেলে এনে দিতে পারেন, সেটা কালকে কৃষ্ণাজি এলে রান্না করে দেবে।
we are getting a lot of disturbance
না, ওই মাছগুলো নেব না,
in the background.
ওই মাছগুলো লাগবে না,
Support team.
অন্য কিছু মাছ। ইলিশ মাছটা যদি ভালো দেখতে।
Dr. Chandana, can you
Hello?
unmute yourself?
Can you mute yourself?
Sorry, unmute yourself. Yes, Kanika, please.
Thank you. We will now proceed with the next talk by Dr. Salil Mehta. He's a senior consultant at Leelavati Hospital, Mumbai, and he would be speaking on the art of systemic immunosuppression, what not to do. Dr. Salil, sir, please.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, sorry. Small last minute glitches. So just let me share my screen. Thanks, Kanika, for putting this all together. And thank you for inviting me. So I've just decided to give you a few tips and pointers. This is going to be a little bit of a theoretical talk. A few tips and pointers about what to do, and especially of what not to do. Just give me a second. This thing is just not going forward. So this is something that we want to avoid at all costs. When patients come too late with either pre-thysical or thysical eyes, and then we are just left with nothing else to do for them. So we all know that the long-term use of systemic corticosteroids is no longer acceptable. And there is so much evidence supporting the efficacy of corticosteroid-sparing regimens, what we call as immunosuppressive therapy, in treating various entities. So in general, the rule of thumb is that if the inflammation cannot be controlled with less than 10 mg per day within 3 months, you need to think in terms of starting immunosuppressive medication. And many experts now believe that the maximum permissible dose is now 5 mg or less. So we know what the problems of steroids are: increased BP, exacerbation of diabetes, bone loss, redistribution of body fat, hirsutism, acne, metabolic changes, weight gain, and a variety of other issues. So pitfall number 1, which I have found: premature labeling patients of uveitis as steroid failure. Sometimes we don't use the right drug, we don't use the right dose, and we don't use the right duration. So when you see various steroid options that are available, betamethasone, dexamethasone, methylprednisolone, I have often found that patients are either under-prescribed the drugs, or they are not prescribed it for the right duration. Once they do not get better, they're simply labeled as steroid failure and then referred elsewhere. So when we do treat patients, we need to remember that both for topical as well as systemic steroids, it's important not to taper the drug too fast. So when you're giving systemic steroids, you need to reduce it by 10 mg a day, often weekly, and you can go on reducing it by week. And when you reach 7.5, you need to taper it over every month rather than just stopping it over the next week. So the first pitfall is not to taper it too fast and not to reduce the dose to a bare minimum too early. The second pitfall I found is that uveitis is very commonly caused by infections in India. Before you start immunosuppressives, you need to rule out the 2 commonest infections. One is, of course, tuberculosis by Mantoux, CT chest, and physician opinion. And second is syphilis by VDRL and FDA ABS before you even think of starting any immunosuppressive treatment. Pitfall number 3, not to recognize certain phenotypes. Certain uveitic entities like birdshot, VKH, which you can see on the left side, or Behçet's, which you can see on the right side, are all recurrent and severe forms and tend to be blinding. Birdshot, VKH, Behçet's, and serpiginous need early immunosuppressive treatment, and they are simply not going to respond to corticosteroids no matter how early or what dose you give. In all these phenotypes, you need to start immunosuppressive treatment as soon as possible. The next pitfall, the inability to recognize certain ocular complications, which means that either you are not treating them with adequate corticosteroids, or the corticosteroids are not working and you need to elevate to a higher immunosuppression. These include progressive Seineke, steroid IOP rise, cataract, loss of RPE, visual field loss, and of course, some of the most common ones which we must not miss: capillary dropout and neovascularization, development of uveitic glaucoma, uveitic macular edema, inflammatory CNVMs. If you see any of these, this is a red flag that you need to elevate the treatment to immunosuppression. The next pitfall which I have found is incomplete monitoring. You need to evaluate these patients for any comorbid conditions, which sometimes they simply don't tell you because they don't think it's important. Whether they've had any organ transplants in the past, any malignancies in the past, diabetes. Diabetes is, of course, the biggest problem because none of them are ever in control. They've not got investigated for a long time. Their age, their occupation, the history of travel, high-risk sexual activity, history of exposure to TB, history of blood transfusion. Ideally, we should even consider hepatitis B screening, hepatitis C screening, HIV screening, and most important of all, never initiate any patient on immunosuppressive treatment without thoroughly evaluating for the possibility of underlying tuberculosis in India. So you can do a MANTU, you can do interferon gamma, you can do chest X-ray, ideally to do a chest CT before you start anything at all. And the most important thing is, of course, let us learn to work together with rheumatologists to manage these patients. Thanks. I've just kept it short so that it could be easy.
Thank you, sir. We will now be proceeding with some questions. Does anyone have any questions for, we can start with Dr. Salil first about systemic immunosuppression. So I have a question.
Please.
Do you do the TPMT test before starting a patient on azathioprine?
Before, generally the drug of choice which I have been using last couple of years is mycophenolate mofetil. And I found that it works well, and at least I do a baseline MANTU before starting them on mycophenolate mofetil.
Okay, so the basic test that you do before starting anyone on immunosuppression includes a MANTU test, and other than that, so what are the basic investigations that you perform?
As of now, I'm only doing MANTU test unless there is a history of some systemic disease or they have had some systemic infections in the past. In that case, I take a physician opinion before starting them on treatment.
Okay. And so what is the first line of therapy? Like when do you, what is your trigger for starting a patient on a biologic agent? Like, is there any way you start with
nothing?
a biologic?
I think it's just a clinical judgment. I think it's just a clinical judgment. If patients are not responding to systemic steroids within, I put it 4 to 6 weeks, I generally think of upgrading to either some form of immunosuppression or to some form of biologics. or
would
they start
any-
developing complications like the one I've shown.
Dr. Vishali, would you like to comment on this? That any conditions where you would like to have a like start immunosuppression with the biologic agent right away?
I think many times with the initial biologics, there was a fear of antibody development, and many times our rheumatologists were recommending to start immunosuppression with it. But nowadays, that's not really the concern. Only time I would give immunosuppression is because it's very difficult to wean the patient off biologics. So many times after the first 6 months or so, we start increasing the interval, and that is where you are not very sure when you are doing the PR and think how the disease will come back. So for that reason, in some of the very severe cases, I keep them under the cover of immunosuppression, and these are mostly JIA, who receive methotrexate and
I agree.
Kanika, I just want to. I think now I never use biologic as a first line therapy, but only two conditions I send them to my rheumatologist for starting biologic is one is severe Behçet disease, and the second one is necrotizing scleritis impending to perforation. So these are the condition. Earlier we used to give cyclophosphamide. I have started avoiding cyclophosphamide in young patients and for other patients also. So I usually send them to my rheumatologist.
Cyclophosphamide, the problems of fertility are very much severe.
Exactly, sir.
Severe.
In pediatrics, the management of systemic manifestations of JIA, biologics has become the drug of choice. So many of these children are on biologics because of the coexistent systemic manifestations. And
I
not
agree.
high features.
Even for routine rheumatoid arthritis, more and more rheumatologists are thinking in terms of adalimumab now first line.
Psoriasis as well. I mean, quite a few of these conditions, they have moved on to biologics.
Because it is subcutaneous, it is only once in 15 days, and it is really not that expensive.
One good part about these conditions is actually rheumatologist himself will start the biologic in them. Whereas in necrotizing scleritis or in Behçet's ocular involvement only, they will be reluctant. I have seen rheumatologists advising methotrexate for a necrotizing scleritis impending perforation. So I think these are the few conditions you have to actually tell your rheumatologist friend that how severe the ocular inflammation is.
That is true. Because for some reason they think the eye is a small little organ.
Exactly.
They don't realize the importance of high-level immunosuppression.
In addition to the conditions discussed, conditions like granulomatosis, polyangiitis, ocular involvement with the renal involvement, we go with the biologics as a first drug and they do respond well.
So I think going hand in hand with the rheumatologist is very important to discuss the systemic condition of the patient along with the ocular status of inflammation. Thank you. I have another question for Dr. Partho. Sir, in case of a diagnostic delay in suspected viral versus toxo-retinitis, do you ever go for a blanket therapy for patient where you treat with both anti-toxoplasma and with antiviral drugs? Have you?
I prefer to avoid that, Kanika. I send the patient for a biopsy to I am not a vitreoretinal surgeon. So in retinitis case, I'll send to my vitreoretinal colleague to do a biopsy and send it for PCR. I'll wait for that. I usually don't prefer to give blanket therapy.
For a vitreous biopsy?
Yeah.
Okay. And have you encountered situations where the PCR from the AC tab or the vitreous is negative and you had to do a repeat AC tab for driving?
Yeah, it happened quite a time. But usually I feel the viral PCR is relatively more sensitive than the toxoplasma.
Mm-hmm. And so any experience with the Whitmer-Goldman coefficient which is
Unfortunately, actually, yeah, I would love to use it more frequently, but it actually does not happen all the time. Samples and all, it's difficult actually to collect and calculate.
I
Kanika,
just want to know from the panel.
can I ask one question
Yes.
to Dr. Partho?
Yes, ma'am.
Partho,
ma'am.
if you get a negative PCR for toxo, I mean, that really doesn't rule out toxo, no? Because the sensitivity of that test is as low as 40%.
Yeah, exactly.
So is there any worth of doing that test?
Toxo, ma'am, toxo, I believe it's mainly a clinical diagnosis. Most of the time, the one mistake we do in toxo is not paying attention to the serum IgG. So serum IgG, if it is 4 to 5 times raised than the normal level, and you have a clinical characteristic lesion, and even if your anti-toxo IgM is negative, I think you should consider it as a toxo. Because I've seen a couple of cases where toxo IgGM is negative. Toxo IgG is like raised in the range of like 150, 200. So these are the situation you have to consider it as a toxo.
And sir, regarding viral serologies, how much attention do you pay to
I
viral?
don't do actually. I don't pay attention to it. I believe this, especially for the herpes virus, there is no sense of doing a ELISA or any serology and treating it on the basis of it alone.
And for viral retinitis, Partho, what is your usual duration of antiviral therapy?
Antiviral therapy, I usually give a long-term therapy. So sometimes, I have to check the socioeconomic condition of the patient also. Valacyclovir, if they find it difficult to continue, then I switch over them to acyclovir because it's relatively cheaper than the valacyclovir tablet.
One more thing, sorry, Kanika, I'm coming in between your discussion, but I just wanted to ask another thing on toxoplasma, that I wanted from the experts that any patient you have seen who actually needs a kind of a maintenance dose of anti-toxo treatment, the moment you stop and they have a recurrence and they actually, I was reviewing the literature, there is a description of a maintenance dose where you give it twice a week. And so any thoughts on that?
That in patients with recurrent toxos, when you want to put them, there is something called prophylaxis dose of Ceftrion, 1 tablet every 3rd day. There are 2 major studies. One is given them alternate day for 1 year, other is given 3rd day for 2 years. It works. So if you have a patient who's having too many recurrences, prophylactic regimen can be like we give. So it can be safely given.
Thank you, ma'am.
I've used it for a patient with the systemic sarcoidosis with toxoplasmosis, where we have to maintain the patient on systemic immunosuppressive therapy to control the sarcoidosis. In that particular patient, I've used it for prophylactic toxo for about 1 year along with systemic immunosuppressive therapy. The patient did well without any recurrences.
There is, I think we must understand that there is no drug which is cysticidal.
Only problem when you stop this prophylaxis, chances of recurrence will come back. So as long as you are giving the prophylaxis.
Cystistatin.
And one last question for Dr. Padma Malini. Ma'am, can you just list the diagnosis where you prefer local steroid therapy in uveitis?
If it is an anterior uveitis alone, we maintain them with topical steroids. If the patient has intermediate uveitis localized to the eye without any systemic manifestations, I prefer to go ahead with either the posterior subtenons and intravitreal steroid implant can be given in that particular condition. If these are the 2 things I prefer to give, or if the patient has a bilateral disease, with the systemic condition is contraindicating to take the systemic medications, then I prefer local therapy without systemic disease association.
Ma'am, any posterior uveitis, unilateral posterior uveitis where you prefer to use or where you use the local therapy, local
Yes.
steroid.
Posterior uveitis, if it's localized only to the eye, if it is not associated with infective etiology, then we can consider giving local steroid, periocular or intravitreal steroid injections.
So if there is time, Kanika, there is one question from the from Dr. Shahana, who says that what is the role of negative serology, IgG in toxo and viral retinitis?
Serology has no role anywhere except in syphilis. Hello.
Yes, ma'am, we could hear that. That puts the question to rest. Go ahead, Kanika.
Any further questions? Thank you all for this very interesting, very enlightening session. At least I learned a lot from all of you. And thank you so much for joining me for this instruction course. And I really hope to see each one of you and meet you all in person very soon once the pandemic is over.
Thank you. Thank you, Kanika.
Thank you, Kanika. Nice.
Thank
you.
Well put together. Really nice. Thank you.
Thank you,
all.
Kanika.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
This seems to be in his bed, though.
Sorry, ma'am.
I said Salil seems to be in his bed right now.
I put the alarm for 7, but I just couldn't wake up. My eyes just opened 5 minutes only ago.
Back to sleep. Bye-bye.
So I'm just not used to waking up on Sunday mornings early,
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you,
Okay.
sir. For
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kanika.
Thank you, ma'am. Bye-bye.